Good to go. Oh, thank you.
I was just gonna say, first thing before she gets out of the room, one, thank you. And if you haven't already, make sure you thank the MD Expo staff. They worked really, really hard to pull this together for us. So make sure you, when you see them in the hall, say thank you and give them a little love and appreciation there. So, well, thanks for taking part of your morning with me. I want to give you an update. Some of you have heard me talk on this topic before. We'll talk about the project, and we'll talk about what I like the best about the project is why we do it. So this is the CMMS project. It was sponsored by AAMI, and today's focus is on work order types. So let's see if we can get this to work. All right, so the agenda, as I said, we'll talk about the project itself. I want to go through that fairly quickly, but if I go too quickly, just stop me, okay? And we'll go back and dig a little deeper if that's helpful to you. I want to get to the second part here where we talk about why this standardization of data can drive benefit for you. Because I don't know about you guys, but I don't like to do something just because. I like to have a reason why. I need to understand what's the value proposition to me to go through this effort. Okay, so the project itself was driven by a number of things. Those of us that have been around for a while, and probably those of you that maybe have only been around for a week or two, recognize that we have a real serious problem with benchmarking because our data doesn't line up, right? It's really hard to match things when they don't match. And we've found that the driver behind, the real problem behind is the time required. So what I hear from lots of my colleagues, and I'm sure I said it too at some point in my career, is it just takes too long. It's too hard to get to that. I just need to get done. Just need to get my work done, right? Well, as I progressed through my career, I realized that now I was responsible for making decisions, use this data to make decisions about what we were going to do and why we were going to do it, and how we were going to do it. And boy, that data was really hard to work with. I had to spend hours cleaning it up, right? So as an industry, there's lots of people feeling this way. And it's really one of the things that help drive us is this general sense that we really do have to sort of clean up our house so that we can make better data-driven decisions. And a couple of other good reasons why is that regulatory agencies sort of make the rules for us, right? They tell us what to do, whether that's CMS or Joint Commission or DNV or whomever, right? They make the rules. Now, we'd at least like to have a voice in influencing them, right? Well, then we have to have data to support the statements that we're going to make. And then you'll see later one of the other drivers, because there's a lot of activity right now around how do I implement an AEM program? Well, if you don't have the data, you might as well just stop worrying about that, right? So those are some of the drivers that moved us forward. And the small group of us that were sort of in a hallway having a conversation said, well, maybe we could take the Iowa principle. If we build it, maybe they'll come, right? So rather than everybody trying to do it individually, let's build something that people can come to rather than having to build it themselves. Okay, but we needed a team. There were just a few of us, and so we pulled our colleagues together, primarily being, and there's some folks here in the room, from the CMMS suppliers. We really put out a request to a lot of folks, CMMS suppliers, and asked if they'd like to participate. And I can promise you that the primary players were quick and jumped at the opportunity to participate with us. So we took the idea to AAMI. Yes?
What's CMMS?
I'm sorry, that's an excellent question. It's a very old abbreviation, Computerized Maintenance Management System. And the reason I say it's really old is that when I started my career as an intern, we had files and files and files of paper records. And so that was a term that was applied when suddenly we had mainframe computers and then ultimately laptops into where we are today in a more IT informed world. So it's sort of an old term, but it's just sort of stuck. But that's it's the management, and I differentiate too. It says management. Some people call it your asset management system, but it's the maintenance aspects of your asset management as opposed to the full like depreciate. The finance has their own asset management system. Okay. So the group of us took this idea to AAMI. We sat around and talked about it in 2019, and AAMI agreed this was a good initiative for us to take on. And we started in 2020 working on failure codes, because that was the feedback we were getting. Lots and lots of failure codes. We can't compare things. They're not being used in a standardized way, so we tackled that. And it was very well received. And if you're interested, and later in the slide deck, you'll see there's a link to that. But because we had good success, and because the group in the course of doing the 2020 project, we recognized that, boy, there's a real problem with how people use work order types, which is sort of where we start, right? Is this a scheduled, or is this a prepare? What kind of work is this doing before we ever get to reporting what the failure was or the corrective action was, right? So we proposed that as the 2021 work. So that's more what we'll focus on today, is the latest work. When we started the initiative, we really sort of had some guiding principles of, if we're going to create standards, they need to conform to these sorts of things. Like, they need to be clear, right? People need to be able to easily understand them. They need to be practical. They need to have a single purpose. You need to be able to see this phrase or this word and know exactly what that means. The choices that you have as the person doing any documentation needs to be exhaustive. There needs to be a choice there that meets your needs. But they also need to be exclusive. And this is a sort of a tenuous balance between having enough, but not so much that it's not just an exhaustive list, but I'm exhausted going through the list trying to find the thing I want, right? So there was this balance that we needed to strike as we went through this. And that's the limited number of choices, if you will. And then for the management side, these actions needed to be, the fields needed to give us actionable information, right? Not just counts of things, but when I play with this data, when I start analyzing it, I can actually make decisions based upon it. This was what we set this forward in 2020 for the initial failure codes, and we maintained it as we moved into work order types. So this is a real quick reminder. These were the drivers that made failure code analysis really important. The AEM program, managing your PM performance, forecasting equipment replacements, and also being able to give feedback to manufacturers about design and manufacturing issues. So think recalls, or failures, mean times between failures and things like that. We looked at an incredible number of work orders. The gentleman I worked with, Matt Baratich, many of you probably know Matt. He and I looked at an incredible number of work order pieces of data that were provided by our participants, in this case, Superior Analytics, but the CMS providers, suppliers also provided us with data that we were able to go through. This is all blinded. I have no idea if it came from any of your hospitals. It probably did, but I don't know, right? So we just saw the data itself. And we found that there were lots of things listed as a failure code that are not failures. Right? They're descriptive and they're important pieces of information, but they're not failure codes. I mean, cannot locate is sort of a failure for me, the HTM person. I failed to find it, but it's not a failure about the device, right? That's important to know. Some of the sort of, it was an inspection request. Well, that's not a failure. So we sort of collected these things, and this gave us a sense of, okay, this bucket, failure, has become sort of just a catch-all, right? So then, as we analyzed that data, looked at what sort of bubbled to the top, this is the list. There's two lists. We decided to take it a step further because not only do we want the codes, which are all these bullet points, but we also wanted to think back to why were we doing this, right? It's not just about standardizing the failure codes, it's why are we doing it? Well, for failure codes, it was primarily driven by more actionable information required to manage PM, or schedule maintenance, right? So which of these failure codes were related to PM failures and which ones are not? So as a management person, you could look at the data in a way that would help you manage your PM better based on failure sort of data. Okay. We wrote a white paper on this. It's published on the AAMI website. In fact, if you Google AAMI white paper, I think it pops up right away. So this is all the detail is built into that in terms of what we did, how we did it, and how we reached this conclusion. So I want to jump to the next one, because as I said, that work really spawned the next idea, which is, wait, we need to back up. We need to go up in altitude and look at work order types and begin looking at this, because there were some great comments amongst the group that said, hey, I need to be able to distinguish between things that are related to maintenance and things that are not maintenance work. It all has to still get done, and I need to track it all, but I need that ability to differentiate as I'm reporting out to my management, to my senior leaders in the organization. So a couple of sort of obvious examples is, I need to know the difference between maintenance and non-maintenance so I can build the right staffing model. And you have the right people doing the right kind of work. And I need to forecast my budget, not just for people, but for the actual maintenance activities, right? So those were two very sort of no-brainer, boy, we really need to differentiate here. And then certainly there were opportunities for optimizing, continuing to optimize the program itself. You want to differentiate maintenance work from non-maintenance so that your AEM program is appropriately justified, right? You want to make sure you understand whether your PM program is working, right? I'm doing things in a certain way, a certain method and a certain frequency. Is that actually working, right? And then again, more of that forecasting, when do I need to replace technology in the future? This is probably a pretty important definition that we adopted as a work group, that work order types are used for a single CMMS asset, which is a single line in your database, okay? So that was an important distinction to make sure we understood what we meant by asset. So it's a line item, and you're likely to associate costs with this line item, okay? So this was going to help us understand where maintenance and non-maintenance are. Like a meeting, non-maintenance, there's not going to be a line item in your CMMS for a meeting asset, unless you maybe have chairs. I don't know. But yes, sir.
Since it is called a maintenance management system, was there any debate on whether or not non-maintenance stuff should be tracked in our maintenance management system, like admin, work orders?
Yes, we did have some of that conversation, but that fell in the domain of, that is not about standardizing the codes that or the choices, but that would be a site by site, program by program decision of, if you're going to collect the data, please do it in a standardized way. If you're not going to collect the data, then you don't need to worry about it. But the plan was not to say that you should or should not have non-maintenance activities in your CMMS. Yes.
So you were drilling into the aspects that would be related to the analysis of the piece of equipment and placing need, things like that, as opposed to the general labor utilization department, which can be handled, like you were just saying, locally. You can find other codes that handle these flows, medical clinic manager, something like that. But the things that are directly related and are discontinuous between systems for tracking, oh, this affected the usability, the life, things that are strictly on a piece of equipment on that asset, or what you won't need it to standardize the codes on. In other words, you didn't need to standardize codes on like the Zoom meeting, but you did need to standardize codes on things.
No, we did. No, we said the whole bucket, the whole bucket, because there are programs either internally or externally. Remember back to this idea of benchmarking, whether I'm measuring against myself or my colleagues, is I want to be able to look at a very high level, how much of my time and resources spent in a maintenance activity, how much of my time and resources spent in non-maintenance activities. And then if I want to drill down into those, either of those buckets deeper, then things like the failure codes or other fields would allow you to go down into either of those buckets. Not required to do any of that. You know, like if you don't want to track the non-maintenance stuff in your program, fine. I mean, that's sort of your programmatic choice. But if you're going to do it, what our work group is asking is that you adopt the standard code so that we can do that sort of comparative work either inside your organization or across organizations. You know me, Bob. I'm not going to look at the little, big picture.
No, that, I mean, that's quite
Yeah.
challenging.
Yes.
For competing products.
Yes. Yes. And that, thank you for saying that, because that's really, really important. And it goes back to the very beginning of this initiative, is in no way did we want this project to limit any of the CMMS suppliers' product development. We're not trying to standardize their systems. We're trying to standardize how we name things, right? And then the suppliers all have the ability to build that into their platforms and all of the creativity that they bring to the marketplace and differentiation and whatnot. We're in no way trying to minimize the competitive advantage of any given group. It's really them participating, providing feedback from all of you. How can they, and there's some in the room, I'll let them at the end kind of talk about what the value was to them, but they really want to build a better product for you, and be able to answer the questions you're asking them, which is, what code should I have? So this is where we try to build it, and hopefully you will come. Okay. All right. So again, best thing to do is analyze work orders, right? So we got a wealth of information from all the CMMS platforms. Superior Analytics provided things to us. The VA provided their like 45, what they call uniform work actions, which are essentially work orders for the VA. And we piled all of that sort of thing in, and we began looking for similarities. So across them, and just one example I'll highlight here is for PM. Some people, it was just PM, SM, which we're assuming meant scheduled maintenance. And I say assume because I don't know who it was that put it in there. Silly maintenance. I didn't think that was right. Yeah, right. So we're going to assume that in this case, PM, SM, that meant something like this: planned maintenance, preventive maintenance, and preventative maintenance. So these are all, this was assumed to be all pretty much in that same intention, right? This is stuff we schedule, and it's based on manufacturer recommendations. It would be part of our AEM program, those sort of things, right? And again, we found lots of things that are not work order types. They're things you do, like calibration is a very important thing you do on a work order, but it's not a work order type. Okay, so you think of it as sort of a hierarchy, right? You start with what kind of work order am I doing, and then you get more granular. So again, similar sort of activity, look at the data, see what flows to the top in terms of similar intent, but maybe the words are slightly different. And then what are the things that jump out that don't belong? Okay. That brought us to our recommended set, and this will be published later this year. Matt and I sent the white paper in just last week. So the AAMI folks are working through the publication process, but that will be available, I'm hoping, before the end of the year. But just as we did with failure codes, where we split them between PM related and non-PM related here, we wanted to make sure these codes showed up in terms of what are maintenance related and what are not maintenance. We had a lot of conversations about this because you're going to notice in this list, we have some that come across both sides. So I'll take one of our favorites, cybersecurity. One of my favorites, gives me nightmares on a regular basis for a host of reasons. Maintenance, you might have a cybersecurity work order if you're out doing patches. If you're actually applying the patches, you're actually doing some form of remediation in the field to a particular device. Because remember, maintenance work requests are associated with a particular device, a particular asset in your inventory. So you would be able to say, I spent 1 hour applying this patch to asset number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right? Okay. Now, on the other side, on the non-maintenance side, what if you're sitting in a meeting with your IT colleagues, your CISO and company, and you're defining what is our cybersecurity program, or you're defining how you're going to do risk assessment for cyber aspects of your program, right? You're designing the program, not actually executing on the program, if you will. You're not touching a particular device. Does that make sense? Sort of, yeah. It's, you kind of got to get in and use it a little bit, yeah. And again, in an effort not to be overly prescriptive and tell you how to run your program, we wanted to give you the option to say there's the sort of the more strategic and the management side of an activity like cybersecurity, and then there's the maintenance implementation that is applied to a particular device or system, and give you that option. Now that gets may get a little squirrely in your system, and you may need to use subcodes to differentiate, right? So maybe if you're doing cybersecurity maintenance, then you may need to go back to the failure codes and use one of them so that it's clear to you as a manager or as a technician that this was maintenance activity, not cybersecurity programmatic activity. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so that, having been on the team, that's a little different than when I think we had got the first thing I'm thinking of as a CMMS provider is how would you, one of the things you want to do is identify these are my maintenance related activities and these are my non. And if they're called the same thing, then
I'm not going to tell you how to do it. I'm going to tell you. No, well, no. All right. Yeah, I probably did, but I'm not going to ask anybody in this room to do something I haven't already done or had to do. When you're a manager, you got to make hard decisions, right? You got to set the rules of the road. And maybe it's complicated like I just described, or maybe you say, we're never going to use cybersecurity as a non-maintenance code. Or maybe you say, we're never going to use cybersecurity as a maintenance code. But as a manager, you have to make those decisions. That's key to any of this working, is that as a management team, you demonstrate some leadership by working with your technical staff and looking at your program and working with your hospital colleagues and understanding what's the right decision, what are the right set of rules, policy in our organization, because mine might be different than what Isabella has in hers, right? Because of some of the local dynamics, politics, knowledge base,
but
whatever.
benchmarking and more difficult, everybody's doing it differently. That's the purpose, so we have everybody doing it the same way.
Understand, but at benchmarking, if we're only doing it at the work order level, we're already at a very high level anyway. If we want to get more granular, we've got to have benchmarking. That's why we said, all right, we need to do work orders because that's sort of where we start. And then as we look at these individual fields, we can get more granular with the benchmarking.
Calling them all the same thing is the first step, and that's
yeah. Oh, we're light years ahead of where we are today.
And some of it, Carol, I wonder if it may also be tied to roles and responsibilities.
Yes.
Maybe that's how we find it as well, that there may be a cybersecurity that applies to a technical level, and there may be cybersecurity that's more of a, depending on.
Exactly. No, that's a great example, and I've worked with health systems that were that way, where all the programmatic things were, if you will, handled by IT, and unfortunately, clinical engineering biomed had not a lot of voice in that, but they were fully burdened with the maintenance implementation side. And then to your point, I also seen clinical engineering biomed HTM programs where they had this staff does the programmatic piece, this staff does the maintenance. So I think that's the sort of decisioning, that's the sort of program design that you have to do as a manager so that all of this makes sense. And the other piece too is you'll see in the paper, we have some definitions that are not on these slides, but real definitions of what each of these, how we describe them. And it's the documents we had during those work sessions that will give you a sense of that, right? And so then you can make those programmatic design decisions inside your organization. But we can all reference back to the white paper and say, okay, that's what this means, right? Okay.
Carl,
yes.
Why bring up cybersecurity as its own non-maintenance? And could this cause celeb right now, but not have a separate one for telehealth security, capital equipment committee, all these other?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Yeah, it's a great question, and we debated that. I think we had a whole meeting around that particular one, and maybe a couple of the others as well. And it is because it's a hot topic right now. I think the group as a whole is also a proponent of this isn't one and done. That as we set standards, like any good standards program, you go back and review it, right? Even like how we design medical devices. Those standards get reviewed on a periodic basis. We as a community need to go back and say, you know, in a couple of years, 3-5 years, whatever, and say, we need to revisit this, and does it still make sense? Should cybersecurity still be there? Well, maybe. So we have to revisit those. Yes, sir.
I wonder, and I don't know the CMMS company's capabilities, but I wonder if one level above work order types might be work order categories, because everything we do is either planned or it's not.
Mhm.
And you could go back and look at your work, how much of my work was planned and how much, for instance, and then within those work order categories, planned and unplanned for these work order types, because cybersecurity could be a response to a threat and it's not planned versus your monthly patching or whatever you have that is planned.
Yeah, we had all of those sort of conversations, and I think there are schools of thought, but it kind of goes back to how would I design my program in my organization, right? And so, like any benchmark, no benchmarking situation is ever perfect. Bob and I have worked on that for years, right? And it's never perfect. But what makes it workable is if you have definitions, and if you can describe, if you've designed and not just sort of winged it, then you have the ability to say, this is sufficiently similar to match to this, right? Okay, I only use cybersecurity as a maintenance work order, but I'm using a subcode for planned or scheduled, corrective or planned, right? Or I might do it the other way. I mean, my personal tendency would be, I probably wouldn't use cybersecurity. I would probably have planned and corrective. And then these other ones are subcodes to those, right? But as long as I use the same definition of what these things are, then Heidi and I can, or Isabel or whomever, we can compare notes, because we can gather, here's what we want to compare. And so then I can bring my data and describe it. They can bring their data and describe it, and we can still manage it. But the idea is that let's keep the words defined, the activities defined consistently, so that then as our database is structured, we can pull data in such a way that we can do comparisons. Now, another one I want to point out to you that really we had to spend a fair amount of time making sure that we were clear on is this one, incident investigation. How many of you guys report to IT? Roll up to IT. Oh, come on, really? That's all? Okay, well, that's maybe a third of the room. That's probably about right. Okay, so anybody that's worked with IT, the word incident is when anything goes sideways for them. Like the laptop won't reboot. Who cares? Get another one. For us, incident means something really bad happened or almost happened, right? This is injury, this is death, this is serious business, right? So one of the things that we did not do, in the white paper you'll see we made a recommendation of a code you could use, which I believe is adverse event. Is that right, Heidi? But in the course of this presentation, we want to make sure that we were talking about incident investigations in HTM language, right? But the code that you work out with your CMMS supplier is probably going to be something more like adverse event, so that you can differentiate it from the something just went sideways from IT, especially those that you report into. But that's a place where we didn't say you got to define it. You don't have to make the code a specific thing, because different CMMS systems use numbers and letters and words and whatnot. And we didn't want to get into that level of system design or platform design, but the idea is that whatever your supplier, whatever your CMS uses, it needs to define up with what we mean by incident investigation. Okay, so you can separate that. All right, so what's happening, what's coming? Another white paper. Meet with your suppliers, your CMMS suppliers, because they're building this into their products. to provide you, in some cases, default or migration, depending upon where you are. If you're already in install base, how can they help you migrate to this? If you're a new customer, how can they help you implement it? All of them are just, really being, they wouldn't have been involved if they weren't supportive of this idea and didn't want to help you as HTM professionals. So go to them, ask them the questions. How are you doing this? How do we implement this at my site? And then that's exactly, the adoption. We don't get anywhere if you don't come to what's been built, right? We don't get to play the baseball game out in the cornfield. Nobody shows up. So our hope is that you will do that. Now, let's jump quickly though, because as I said at the beginning, I don't like to do things if I don't know why I'm doing it, right? So one of the things that Matt Baratich and I have been talking about are AEM programs. To implement an AEM program, you got to have good data, right? You have to be able to justify why you're doing something different than what the manufacturer recommended, whether that's frequency or methodology or both. You have to be able to support that. And I don't care if you're with Joint Commission, DNV, your local state, whatnot. More and more, I'm hearing about folks that are being challenged on their, I have an AEM program. Super, show me. Right? I'm hearing that more and more. You knew it was coming. I'm hearing it regularly. So this is really one of those reasons why you want to get your data clean, right? Is so that you're not wasting. This is back to, I want to make sure I have the right staffing level, make sure I have the right people doing the right work, that have data to support it, data to support the move and migration to AEM designations. And then Matt's done a great job of defining a lot of the terms and the process and methodology. I'm not going to go into how do you build an AEM program. That's a whole 3 days worth of conversation. But to be able to know what you're doing, this falls under the plan maintenance, right? This is under what we do, how we do it. Is this OEM? Is it AEM? You got to have all the data clean so that you can differentiate that, right? And then you need to be able to do these. Oh, I didn't show right. Okay. Failure rate is what that says, not failure rate, but failure rate. In the meantime, between those failures, right? So you got to have good documentation. You got to know what kind of failure, right? And if you think back to the standard failure codes, you want to be able to differentiate a failure of the device versus a failure of how the device was used versus an environmentally induced failure. You may need to know all those things to be able to justify your AEM program, right? So this is one of those good reasons, and you can see we've got a couple examples here. A failure that could have been prevented by better PM. So this is, you're going to be looking at things like these are corrective maintenance, and a component failure might be the things that you're looking for in there as you're mining your data. Or vice versa, Matt likes to talk a lot about the hidden failures, the things that are not just intuitively obvious to us. Those might come up by mining your planned maintenance work orders that have a standard failure code of calibration. How often are those happening? So this is where implementing both of these, standard work order types gives you a hint of where to start, and then the standard failure codes gives you the guidance on where should I start digging down into the data. Make sense? Okay. So we'll kind of talk through this. The takeaways, using these standard codes are going to flag things for you, and you'll be able to improve. And not just the AEM. The other thing too is those items that are on, they're restricted, if you will, right? Like your imaging gear and your lasers and whatnot. Having this clean data will also let you know if that preventive maintenance or planned maintenance, sorry, I'm still learning, the planned maintenance activities are working, right? Are they successful? Or are you having troubles? If they're not, if it seems like they're not working, that's a flag for you to go back to the manufacturer of the device or system and say, this isn't working out for us. We don't understand why. We have a lemon here. Are we doing something wrong? What's happening here, right? So even those items that are not on an AEM benefit from this data. Now on the other side, sort of more on the strategic forecasting side, I do a lot of the work in this space, is what do I have to do? How do I know when to replace something, right? How do I forecast that out? But other than just, it's on my bench, it's going to cost 3 times to fix it what it would cost to buy a new one. I mean, I'm not talking about that sort of thing. I'm talking about how do you help your organization forecast out 3 to 5 years of what's going to need to be addressed. And in addition to just when does the manufacturer stop making it, or when do they stop selling me parts and service, you may have devices that are mainstream, you can get all that sort of stuff, but it's just tired, right? It's just doesn't work anymore. But the other thing that, well, I just talked about this, the reliability of it, right? We just talked about if I know what the corrective maintenance is on it, how often am I having to fix this thing? I'm probably going to be able to look at that sort of data and and differentiate from, okay, this is just the maintenance requirements this requires, and it's sort of steady state versus maybe a reliability trend, right? Over the last couple of years, I've seen this ratcheting up a little bit. It's costing me more to maintain this. All right, I don't have to panic and replace it immediately, but I probably want to put this out maybe around year 3 or 4. We need to make sure it's on the radar so folks know this is coming and it's not an emergency response sort of thing. And so that's the example I just gave you there, where you're looking at maybe over the lifetime compared to more recent 12 months. I work with a lot of folks to set these sort of things up where they're looking. So you want to see more of a trend. So think of like your clinical partners, right? Same thing on the AEM thing. You're looking at trends, right? Clinicians rarely diagnose on a single point of information, right? They've got all the numbers on the monitor, but they're frequently looking at the trends. How has that changed over the last hour, the last day, the last week, that sort of thing. In our patients, being the medical devices, we're looking at how does that change over the last year, the last 3 years, whatever that window is that makes sense for you, okay? And then more recently, another example on the clinical scoring side, and certainly there you want to make sure your devices are meeting clinical protocols. Do they do what the clinicians need? But if you think about one of the failure codes is use error. So that may factor into a replacement cycle or an upgrade cycle. And I'm looking at Isabella thinking human factors, right? That may be a way that you can identify this device while it works, it don't work because my users can't, on a regular, consistent basis, use it to deliver care or diagnose or whatever the point is. So it's a tool that you can use and say, okay, I'm going to replace this, or I can upgrade it because the new platform has a better user interface, or they fixed this coding problem, or whatever it might be. But that's a way that you can move beyond the technical, which we're all getting pretty good at in terms of being able to forecast when something needs to be replaced because of its maintenance aspects. But this gives you an opportunity to support your clinicians with good data of when a device really is or is not serving their needs. Okay. Same sort of thing, keep it easy. This is mean time between failures, use failures versus mechanical or electrical failures, right? It's the same premise, same equation, same math, just you're drilling down on a different specific failure. Okay. And then the last piece of yes.
Can you go back to that slide?
No, I won't go back. No, I'm just yeah. Absolutely. And my contact info is at the end, and I'm happy to, in fact, I probably even have some handouts so that if you want to see me afterwards, I'll give you, it's got all this written down on it.
I think these are all available, aren't they, after the?
I believe so. There should be a recording of this session as well as the slides. Yeah.
Our user support then would be, that's where you get into that training of a user situations. That's where you're identifying localized market problem.
That's another great example, right? I mean, I built it into a forecasting replacement plan, but more acutely in the moment. Absolutely, you could be tracking the use errors and where those showing up. Well, they're going to be in your corrective, so we're going to go to our corrective pile, right? And then we're going to look for the use error code, and then we can look at it by department and go, we got great users, we don't have a problem with the equipment, and the users are all living, cohabitating nicely, or, ooh, here's a hot spot. What's the problem here? Do we need to go in? guess what? We didn't even train these people when we dropped the technology on them. Or that staff was just turned over. That department turns over all the time. We're just going to have to implement a program to do continuous training. Exactly. Okay. But make a plan, right? So as you're implementing the standards in your department, think about how you're going to use them. Think about why you're going to use them. And then as you get ready to do your, I use this particular template when I'm working with someone who wants to make a forecast plan. What is the data I need, right? What are we measuring, right? What am I trying to analyze? So what are the particular data, as opposed to sort of just opening up and starting to try to pull and match and whatnot. You'll be there for hours. But if you step back for a minute and say, like, what am I trying to measure? Am I trying to do the example we just said? Am I trying to identify if I have user training training requirements? Okay, what are the fields? What type of work requests am I going to need? What kind of failure codes are going to tell me that? I'm trying to create my AEM program. What do I need? I need both planned maintenance and corrective maintenance. And I need to look at the types of failures. So what are the particular failure codes that I want to try? Create a plan. That way, when you go into the database, you can actually pull the data quicker, right? You have less trial and error because you actually, again, make a plan moving into that, the activity, what actionable information, as opposed to stuff just sort of dumping out. Make sense? Okay. So I'm going to stop there. Matt and we're totally open anytime. Emails, calls, whatnot. We're happy to talk about this, help you think through it. But the white paper will be forthcoming, as I say, hopefully before the end of the year. The first one on failure codes is already out there on the AAMI website. It's free to members. I think it's actually free to everyone, isn't it, Heidi?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think it's free to.
Free to AAMI. Okay.
Yeah.
So, any other questions?